Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes Debates. We're diving deep into two economic heavyweights today. John Maynard Keynes, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money from 1936. And Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, which came out in 1944.
Right.
To really get a grasp on their arguments, we're going to need to untangle their contrasting views on some pretty big topics.
What's fascinating is that both books are grappling with the same fundamental questions, how should we organize our economies to create a more just and prosperous world?
Right.
But they arrive at radically different answers.
Okay, so let's start by mapping out the terrain.
Okay.
What's the main argument each book is making?
Well, Keynes, writing in the shadow of the Great Depression, is essentially making the case for government intervention. To stabilize economies, particularly during times of crisis, he argues that free markets are inherently unstable and prone to booms and busts, and when those busts happen, they can lead to prolonged periods of unemployment and suffering. He believes that government can play a crucial role in smoothing out those rough edges and creating a more stable and equitable economic environment.
So don't just stand there, do something.
Yeah.
That's Keynes in a nutshell.
Yes. He's advocating for a more active role for government in managing the economy.
And Hayek.
What's his counterargument?
Hayek, writing during the rise of fascism and communism in Europe, sees things very differently. He argues that any attempt to control or plan the economy will ultimately lead to a loss of individual freedom and a slide towards tyranny. He believes that the free market, with its system of prices and profits, is the best way to allocate resources and coordinate individual efforts. He sees government intervention as a dangerous intrusion that distorts market signals, stifles innovation, and ultimately undermines both economic and political freedom.
So we have a pretty fundamental clash of visions here.
Yeah.
One advocating for government action, the other championing individual freedom and limited government.
Yeah. I'm guessing this plays out across a lot of different things in the books.
Absolutely. Their differing views on the role of government intervention shape their perspectives on everything from unemployment and inflation to the function of money and the balance between individual freedom and the collective good.
Wow.
It's a fascinating debate and one that continues to resonate today.
All right, so let's unpack these themes a bit. Let's start with the role of government intervention.
Okay.
We know Keynes is a fan, but what are some of the specific ways he sees government playing a role in the economy?
Keynes argues that during times of economic downturn, the government can step in and stimulate demand through spending. This could involve investing in infrastructure projects, providing unemployment benefits, or even just cutting taxes to put more money in people's pockets. The idea is that this spending will create a ripple effect throughout the economy, increasing demand for goods and services, leading to more hiring, and ultimately pulling the economy out of recession.
And this is where the famous multiplier effect comes in, right? The idea that every dollar the government spends generates more than a dollar in economic activity.
Exactly. Keynes argues that government spending has a multiplying effect on the economy. So even if the government has to borrow money to fund its spending, the overall impact on the economy is positive.
Okay, so Keynes is all about government stepping in and taking action. What about Hayek? What's his view on all of this?
Hayek is deeply skeptical of this approach. He argues that government spending, even if well-intentioned, will inevitably lead to distortions in the market. He's particularly concerned about the potential for inflation, arguing that printing more money to fund government spending will simply devalue the currency and lead to higher prices.
So Hayek is worried about the unintended consequences of government intervention.
Absolutely. He argues that even the best-intentioned government policies can have unforeseen and often negative consequences. He's also concerned about the concentration of power that comes with government control over the economy.
This is where his fear of the road to serfdom comes in, right? The idea that government control over the economy will inevitably lead to a loss of individual freedom and a slide towards tyranny.
Exactly. Hayek believes that economic freedom and political freedom are inextricably linked. He argues that any attempt to control the economy will inevitably lead to a concentration of power in the hands of the state and a corresponding erosion of individual liberty.
Okay, so we've got these two fundamentally different views on the role of government in the economy.
Yeah.
But what about the individual? How do Keynes and Hayek view the role of the individual within the economic system?
That's a great question. And it gets right to the heart of their different philosophical outlooks. For Keynes, the individual is first and foremost a member of society, and the well-being of society as a whole is paramount.
Okay.
He believes that government has a responsibility to ensure that everyone has a fair shot at a decent life. And that includes providing a safety net for those who are struggling.
So for Keynes, it's not just about individual freedom, but also about social responsibility.
Precisely. He argues that the pursuit of individual self-interest doesn't always lead to the best outcomes for society as a whole. He believes that government has a role to play in correcting market failures, promoting social justice, and ensuring a more equitable distribution of wealth.
And this is where he clashes with Hayek, right? Hayek is all about individual liberty and limited government.
Yes, Hayek sees the individual as the fundamental unit of society. He believes that individuals should be free to make their own choices, pursue their own goals, and reap the rewards of their efforts without interference from the state. He argues that the free market, while not perfect, is the best system we have for protecting individual liberty and allowing people to flourish.
So for Hayek, it's all about creating a system where individuals are free to make their own decisions, even if those decisions sometimes lead to unequal outcomes.
Exactly. He believes that attempts to engineer equality through government intervention will ultimately undermine individual freedom and lead to economic stagnation. He argues that the best way to promote prosperity for everyone is to create an environment where individuals are free to innovate, take risks, and create wealth.
Okay, so we have these contrasting views on the role of the individual and the relationship between individual freedom and the collective good.
Right.
Let's move on to another big theme, central planning.
Okay.
We know Hayek is deeply skeptical of it. What are some of his specific concerns?
Hayek argues that central planning is inherently flawed because it concentrates too much power in the hands of a few. He believes that no single person or group of people can possibly have enough knowledge or information to make wise decisions about how to allocate resources in a complex economy.
Right.
He also worries that central planning will inevitably lead to a suppression of individual initiative and a decline in innovation.
And he saw this happening in real time, right? He was writing The Road to Serfdom as totalitarian regimes were rising in Europe, using central planning to control their economies and their citizens.
Yes, that experience deeply shaped his thinking. He saw firsthand how central planning, even when implemented with the best of intentions, could be used to suppress dissent, control people's lives, and ultimately lead to tyranny. He uses the example of individuals like Mussolini to illustrate how seductive and dangerous the allure of centralized power can be.
Okay, so Hayek is making a pretty strong case against central planning. What's Keynes' take on this? Does he just dismiss Hayek's concerns?
Keynes acknowledges that central planning can be problematic and that there are risks associated with government intervention in the economy. However, he argues that these risks are outweighed by the benefits of economic stability and social justice. He believes that government has a role to play in mitigating the negative consequences of market failures, promoting full employment, and ensuring a more equitable distribution of wealth. He draws on the example of Australia's economic policies during the 1930s. To illustrate this point, he argues that their government interventions successfully mitigated the harsh effects of the Depression.
So Keynes is saying that we need to find a balance between the dynamism of the free market and the guiding hand of government.
Yes. He believes that the market is a powerful engine for creating wealth, but that it needs to be regulated and guided to ensure that it serves the interests of all members of society.
Okay.
He's not advocating for total government control, but rather for a more nuanced approach that recognizes both the strengths and limitations of the market.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about money.
Okay.
Keynes developed this concept of liquidity preference. Can you explain what that is and why it's important?
Sure. Liquidity preference refers to people's desire to hold on to cash, even when interest rates are low. Keynes argued that this desire for liquidity can actually make economic downturns worse. Think about it this way. When people are uncertain about the future, they tend to hoard cash. They might delay making big purchases. They might hold off on investing. And they might even pull their money out of the stock market.
And this hoarding of cash can create a vicious cycle, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
When people hoard cash, it takes money out of circulation, which reduces demand for goods and services. This can lead to businesses cutting back on production, laying off workers, and further deepening the recession.
So how does Keynes propose to break this cycle?
He argues that the government can counter this hoarding by increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates. The idea is to make it less attractive to hold on to cash and more appealing to invest and spend.
So Keynes is suggesting that we can actually use monetary policy to influence people's behavior and stimulate the economy.
Yes. He believed that the government can play an active role in managing the money supply and interest rates to promote economic stability. But this is where Hayek throws up a big red flag.
Oh, I bet he does. What are his concerns about manipulating the money supply?
Hayek argues that manipulating the money supply can lead to inflation, which erodes the value of savings and distorts investment decisions. He also argues that artificially low interest rates can lead to malinvestment, encouraging businesses to take on risky projects that might not be sustainable in the long run.
So Hayek is saying, don't mess with the natural signals of the market. Let interest rates find their own level based on supply and demand.
Precisely. He believes that attempts to game the system will only create more problems down the road.
Okay, so we've got these two contrasting views on monetary policy. Let's move on to another big theme, the role of investment.
Okay.
Both Keynes and Hayek recognize the importance of investment for economic growth, but they have different views on how to promote it. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Keynes argues that government can play a vital role in stimulating investment during economic downturns. He's not just talking about spending on consumption goods, he's talking about investing in infrastructure, education, research, and development, things that will lay the foundation for long-term growth.
What? It's not just about putting money in people's pockets today. It's about building a better future.
Exactly. And Hayek, while generally skeptical of government intervention, does acknowledge the need for certain types of public investment. He argues that the government has a role to play in providing public goods, things like roads, bridges, and basic scientific research that are essential for a functioning economy but might not be adequately provided by the private sector alone.
So there's a glimmer of agreement there, at least in principle.
Yes, but even on this point, their views diverge in important ways. Keynes is more focused on the short term, on using investment to counter cyclical downturns and boost demand. Hayek, on the other hand, is more concerned about the long term, about creating a stable environment that encourages private investment and fosters sustainable growth.
So even when they agree on the importance of investment, their underlying philosophies lead them to different policy prescriptions.
Precisely. And this highlights a recurring theme in their work: the importance of understanding not just what policies are proposed, but the deeper philosophical assumptions that underlie those policies. It's not enough to ask, will this policy work? We also need to ask, what vision of society does this policy embody? What are the trade-offs involved? And what are the potential unintended consequences?
Right. Economics isn't just about numbers and formulas. It's about values, choices, and visions of the good life. And that's what makes these debates so fascinating and so important. Let's talk about another contentious issue: inequality. Keynes, writing in the aftermath of the Great Depression, was acutely aware of the social and economic costs of vast disparities in wealth and income. How did that shape his views on economic policy?
Keynes argued that excessive inequality could undermine demand, lead to social unrest, and ultimately harm everyone, even the wealthy. He saw this as both a practical and moral issue.
So did he propose any specific policies to address inequality?
Yes. He advocated for progressive taxation, the idea that those who earn more should pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes. He saw this as a way to fund social programs, stimulate demand, and create a more just economic system.
Okay, so Keynes is proposing a more redistributive approach to economic policy. What's Hayek's take on this? I'm guessing he's not a big fan of progressive taxation.
You're right about that. Hayek is all about rewarding individual effort and merit, and he sees progressive taxation as a form of punishment for success. He argues that attempts to redistribute wealth are not only economically inefficient, but also morally wrong.
So for Hayek, inequality is simply the natural outcome of a free market, where individuals are rewarded for their talents and efforts.
Exactly. He believes that individuals have a right to the fruits of their labor, and that government should not interfere with this natural process of wealth creation and accumulation. He also argues that attempts to level the playing field through redistribution will inevitably lead to a decline in overall wealth, as those who are penalized for their success will have less incentive to innovate and create.
So on this issue, as on many others, we see a fundamental clash of visions between Keynes and Hayek.
Right.
Let's move on to our final topic: trade. Keynes, writing in the midst of a global trade war, was deeply skeptical of the benefits of free trade, wasn't he?
That's right. He was particularly concerned about the impact of trade imbalances on domestic employment. He argued that countries running persistent trade deficits could experience a decline in demand and employment as money flowed out of the economy to purchase foreign goods.
So Keynes, the champion of government intervention, was willing to intervene in trade as well.
Yes. He even advocated for some degree of protectionism, tariffs and other barriers to trade, to protect domestic industries and jobs. This was partly a response to the economic conditions of his time, as the world was grappling with the aftermath of the Great Depression and the rise of protectionist policies worldwide.
What about Hayek? Was he a free trader, or did he see a role for government in managing trade flows?
Hayek, unsurprisingly, was a staunch advocate for free trade. He saw it as a key driver of economic growth, innovation, and global prosperity. He argued that trade barriers, while often intended to protect domestic industries, ultimately harm consumers by raising prices and reducing choice.
So Hayek believed that free trade benefits everyone in the long run.
Yes, he believed that it fosters peace and cooperation between nations by creating a web of interdependence that makes conflict less likely.
Okay, so on trade, as on most other issues, Keynes and Hayek offer contrasting perspectives, but both were grappling with the same fundamental challenges: how to create a more stable, prosperous, and just economic order. Their ideas, though often at odds, have shaped economic thinking for decades and continue to inform policy debates today.
And that's why it's so important to engage with these ideas, to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each perspective, and to think critically about how these theories apply to the challenges we face today.
I'm struck by how relevant these debates still feel, even though these books were written nearly a century ago.
Absolutely. The fundamental questions they grappled with, the role of government individual freedom versus the collective good, the tension between stability and dynamism, these are timeless questions that every society has to confront.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about how their different historical contexts shaped their views. Keynes writing in the aftermath of a devastating global depression.
Right.
Hayek witnessing the rise of totalitarian regimes.
Yes, those experiences undoubtedly influenced their thinking. Keynes saw firsthand the human toll of economic instability, while Hayek was deeply concerned about the threat to individual liberty posed by centralized power.
And yet, despite their differences, both were ultimately striving for the same thing:
Right.
a better world, a more just and prosperous society.
That's a crucial point. It's easy to get caught up in the ideological battles, but at the end of the day, both Keynes and Hayek were motivated by a desire to improve the human condition.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Keynes and Hayek, what are some of the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they navigate the complexities of the economic world?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that economics is not a science of absolutes. There's no one-size-fits-all solution, no magic formula for creating prosperity.
Right. It's not just about crunching numbers.
Yeah.
It's about understanding human behavior, the incentives that drive us, and the trade-offs we face as individuals and as societies.
Precisely. It's a field of competing ideas, evolving theories, and constant debate.
So we should be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers.
Absolutely. The best we can do is engage with these ideas, understand the different perspectives, and form our own judgments based on the evidence and our own values.
And to always be willing to challenge our own assumptions, to question the conventional wisdom, and to be open to new ideas.
Exactly. The world is far too complex, and the challenges we face far too great to cling dogmatically to any one ideology.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you to ponder these big questions. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those minds engaged.
And never stop questioning. The more we understand these fundamental debates, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions about the kind of world we want to create.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time on Books and Bytes Debates.